They say war is chaos. But chaos I understood. Chaos was random noise, stray rounds, and broken chains of command. Chaos meant opportunity. The real war, the one that broke your soul, started the moment you realized the enemy wasn't seeking victory. He was simply calculating the precise tonnage of steel, rock, and flesh required to wipe you from the earth, reducing you to a mathematical error that needed deletion. I smelled it before I saw it, even through the stink of diesel and stale sea air in the landing craft. Sulfur. Not the pleasant, metallic tang of gunpowder, but the rotten egg stench of the Earth's raw core. It clung to everything, the webbing, the steel ramp, the sweat beading on my brow. Iwo Jima. 7 square miles of volcanic ash and bad temper. My name is Staff Sergeant Elias Vance, but everyone called me Eli. I wasn't frontline infantry. I was a combat engineer with the 5th Marines, meaning my job was to break what others couldn't budge. Concrete, steel, bedrock, if the enemy hid behind it, I was the man they handed the satchel charges and the flamethrower to. Infantry feared the open field. I feared the darkness manufactured by men. The preliminary bombardment had lasted 72 hours. They told us it would look like a moonscape. We watched from the ships as the 15-inch shells churned the beaches. It was magnificent, a truly industrial application of violence. For days, the island was veiled in smoke and fire. When the smoke cleared on the morning of February 19, 1945, the island still looked like a clenched fist. Mt. Suribachi, the ugly, scarred volcano dominating the southern tip, sat there, silent and judgmental. "Looks like we knocked the fight right out of them, huh, Sarge?" Sergeant Gritz, a young man with too much nervous energy and an oversized flamethrower slung on his back, grinned at me from across the landing craft. I didn't answer. I was watching the beaches. They were long, black, and sloping steeply up to the low plateau. There was no visible movement. No return fire. The silence was the first sign of the trap. We had been trained to expect mortars, heavy machine gun fire, and the inevitable banzai charges. We expected to lose 30% of the initial wave before we even reached the high water mark. But there was only silence. The ramp dropped with a screech of tortured metal. The noise was obscenely loud in the vacuum of combat. We spilled out onto the beach, Yellow Beach 1. The sand was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't sand. It was heavy, gritty volcanic ash, the color of soot and crushed bone. It had the consistency of molasses mixed with fine gravel. We sank immediately. Up to our ankles. Up to our knees. Every step was a labor. I carried a standard load, rifle, extra ammo, rations, water, and my specialty kit, 2 Mk2 satchel charges, demolition caps, priming cord, and a roll of wire. The weight immediately doubled. The ash absorbed the impact of our boots, muting the sounds of the advance, making us move in slow motion. We were exposed, trapped in the open, yet still no fire came. "Move it! Move it, goddammit!" Major Sterling screamed, his face red with effort as he tried to run through the sinking medium. We clawed our way forward, 30 yards, 50 yards. The beach was littered with the remnants of the naval barrage, shell casings, torn palm trunks, and strangely, intact spools of wire. We began to bunch up. The infantrymen, weighed down by their rifles and exhaustion, were gasping for air, the sulfur burning their throats. I looked back. The beach was now a crowded traffic jam of Marines and supplies. A perfect target. And still silence. I knelt down, trying to catch my breath, the black ash dusting my helmet. I ran my hand along the ground. Beneath the surface, the ash was hot, radiating residual heat from the volcano and the shelling. This wasn't just a beach. It was an enormous furnace, waiting to be stoked. "Sarge, look!" Gritz pointed toward the first ridge line, about 100 yards inland. I pulled out my binoculars. Along the ridge, a few half-buried concrete structures were visible, their faces chewed up by the big guns. They looked wrecked, defeated. But I noticed something about the angles. They were built to deflect shellfire, not absorb it. And they were low, too low. My internal calculator whirred. 3 days of solid naval bombardment, and they weren't running out onto the beaches in a desperate defense? That meant they didn't need the beaches. They had conceded the coastline as a sacrifice. They were waiting inland. They were waiting underground. The thought chilled me far more than any frontal assault could have. General Tadamaki Kuribayashi, the man defending this desolate lump of rock, wasn't a standard fanatic. He was a thinker. He had transformed the island into a fortress, a vast, interconnected network of tunnels, caves, and pillboxes, often 2 or 3 layers deep. We weren't fighting a perimeter. We were fighting a termite colony made of steel and lava rock. The uncanny silence stretched for exactly 35 minutes. 35 minutes of sweat, exhaustion, and confusion. 35 minutes that allowed us to concentrate on the beaches, to offload equipment, to feel briefly, dangerously secure. Then, the world ended. It didn't begin with a warning whistle or a stray round. It started with a sound I couldn't place. A sudden, deep, guttural rip in the air, immediately followed by the concussive roar of massed artillery. The enemy had been patient. They had waited until the beaches were full, until the logistical infrastructure was set up, until the maximum number of targets were packed into the deep, sticky ash. The fire wasn't coming from the ruined structures ahead. It was coming from everywhere. High-caliber machine guns tore horizontally across the landing zone. Mortars began dropping in coordinated patterns that had to have been calculated months in advance. And heavy guns, 150mm monsters we thought had been silenced, started hammering the clustered landing craft. The air instantly filled with the screams of the wounded and the metallic shrieks of shrapnel. I dove headfirst into the black ash, burying my face, feeling the ground tremor violently as a mortar round impacted 10 yards to my left. Shit! They weren't fighting to defend. They were fighting to annihilate. A runner, his face pale beneath a smear of soot, scrambled toward my position. Sarge Vance! Major Sterling needs you. Key emplacement, Yellow 4 sector. We can't move an inch. It's zeroing in on the command post. I looked up, trying to pinpoint the source of the fire. Through the smoke and flying ash, I saw it, a thick, almost invisible aperture in the side of a low rise near the center of the beachhead. It wasn't a pillbox. It was a slot, perhaps 4 feet wide, perfectly cut into the bedrock, spitting fire with machine gun regularity. It looked like the eye of a reptile staring out of a skull. Yellow 4, I muttered, checking the weight of my satchel charges. Understood. The 35 minutes of silence were over. Now the 36 days began. My mission, which had been theoretical hours ago, was now brutally simple. I had to go into that man-made darkness and eliminate the threat. It was the first hole in the fortress. I knew instinctively, with a cold professional dread, that it would be the easiest one we faced all month. The move from the shoreline to the dune line was the hardest 100 yards I had ever paid for. Every foot forward was a struggle against the sticky, energy-sapping ash, now thoroughly mixed with seawater, blood, and the pulverized remains of concrete. It became a glutinous black mud that clung to our boots and soaked our trousers. It was heavy, hot, and utterly unforgiving. We weren't running. We were wading through lead. The sheer volume of incoming fire was astonishing. The Japanese were utilizing a technique we hadn't encountered on Saipan or Tarawa, interlocking fields of fire designed not only to suppress but to eliminate any attempt at finding cover. Every time a Marine dug a shallow scoop in the ash, a well-aimed mortar round dropped within 5 yards, either collapsing the hole or turning the dirt into deadly secondary shrapnel. I had Grits with me, the flamethrower providing a terrifying, if short-lived, morale boost, and Corporal Hayes, my demolition assistant, a quiet man whose hands were always steady, even when his eyes were wide with fear. "Stay low, Grits. Keep those muzzle flashes suppressed," I yelled over the din. The emplacement at Yellow 4 was still hammering the center of the beachhead. It had an uncanny ability to find the gaps in our cover, moving its fire in smooth, devastating sweeps. I crawled, using my elbows and knees, keeping my satchel charges tucked safely under my chest. A full satchel charge weighed 30 pounds. Right now, it felt like 50. We finally reached a minor swell of ground, a ripple of hard-packed earth that had survived the shelling. I pulled out my field glasses. "Hayes, what do you see?" "Not the damaged one, the active one." Hayes peered through the smoke, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's lower than ground level, Sarge. Look at the blast shield. It's angled back into the slope. And I don't see a roof vent. They're firing through a narrow slit, maybe 10 degrees field of fire." That confirmed my suspicion. Kurabayashi hadn't built conventional bunkers. He had created fortified caves, utilizing the natural terrain and layering it with concrete mined from the island's core. The roofless vents and small slits meant the artillery had done nothing but shave the edges off the entry points. The main structures, the firing chambers and the personnel tunnels, were deep, safe, and entirely operational. "It's the skin, Hayes," I said, tasting the acrid sulfur on my tongue. "We're fighting the skin. The beast itself is deep inside." My analysis dictated the approach. We couldn't use heavy weapons or tank support. The terrain and the intense fire made that impossible. We had to use the one thing they couldn't tunnel away from: concentrated, shaped explosive power. We moved in a staggered rush, using the moments between mortar bursts to gain ground. Grits' flamethrower was useful for blinding the enemy, sending gouts of oily, incandescent flame toward the slot. The intense heat would momentarily suppress the machine gunners inside, buying us perhaps 5 seconds of relative safety. 5 seconds. That was all the time I needed. We reached the base of the rise. The heat radiating off the structure was intense, partly from Grits' recent burst and partly from the internal machinery. The muzzle blast from the firing port smelled of hot steel and cordite. "Grits, give me a heavy spray. Maximum heat, keep it on the slit." Grits nodded, bracing the heavy nozzle. A torrent of fiery napalm erupted, engulfing the front face of the structure. The machine gun instantly ceased fire. "Go, Eli! Go!" I scrambled up the slope, Hayes covering me with his M1. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, panicked drumbeat. I reached the concrete apron beside the firing slot. It was hot enough to scorch the skin through my gloves. I fumbled with the first satchel charge. It was canvas-wrapped, packed with Composition C explosive, and fitted with a detonator and timer fuse. I needed to seat it precisely against the wall, near the edge of the firing aperture, to maximize the blast wave's entry into the narrow space. Click. I set the fuse for 6 seconds. Too short for comfort, but too long risk drawing fire from surrounding, currently silent, emplacements. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the physical effort of moving the weight through the ash. I wedged the charge against the concrete, pulled the pin, and flattened myself against the ground, tucking my head under my arms. "Fire in the hole!" 6 seconds. 6 years. I felt the ground shift, the air compressed into a solid fist that slammed into my chest. The concussion was absolute. For a moment, the world was blinding light, followed by the metallic thwang of shrapnel ricocheting off the concrete. Dust, ash, and smoke erupted. I lifted my head, my ears ringing violently. Hayes was already beside me. "Did it clear?" I shouted, my voice sounding thin and distant in my damaged hearing. We cautiously peered around the corner. The concrete slab was cracked, and the immediate area smelled strongly of burnt gunpowder and, horribly, burnt flesh. The firing slot was twisted, jagged edges of steel jutting out where the barrel had been. No machine gun fire. "It's dead, Sarge. We killed the snake. No haze," I corrected him, rubbing the burning grit out of my eyes. "We just cut off its head. The body is still moving." We moved past the crippled pillbox, heading inland toward the airstrips. The victory was momentary and localized. The second wave of fire began immediately, this time coming not from the shore, but from the ridges of the high ground, perfectly zeroed in on our new positions. The geometry of the fight was clear. They had allowed us to gain ground only to herd us into another killing zone. I looked back at the beach. The sight was sickening. Wounded men lay half buried in the black sludge, screaming for medics, who couldn't reach them. Bodies were dissolving into the ash. The logistics chain was broken before it began, tangled up in the carnage. My focus returned to the task ahead. We had cleared one spot, but the entire island was a massive, interconnected nervous system. We needed to systematically dismantle Kurabayashi's masterpiece of defense, one bunker, one cave, one man at a time. And to do that, we had to go deeper. "Next position, Hayes. We need to find the main tunnels. This whole island is a subterranean nightmare, and we haven't even gone below ground yet." I checked my remaining charges. 2 down, 8 to go. It felt like trying to stop a tidal wave with a shovel. The battle quickly shifted from a linear beach assault to a three-dimensional war of attrition. By the second day, we weren't just fighting the Japanese. We were fighting the geology. The black ash was still the primary obstacle, absorbing tank traction, silencing our movements, and hiding booby traps with insidious efficiency. But the real enemy was beneath our feet. The marine advance was excruciatingly slow. Every yard had to be purchased with blood and explosives. The engineer's role became critical and horribly intimate. We were the executioners. The infantry would locate a firing port, suppress it long enough for us to get close, and then we would deliver the final, brutal solution. I started logging the structures in my head, a grim professional inventory. The bunkers weren't just deep. They were designed for long-term survival and counterattack. They featured reinforced concrete up to 10 feet thick, labyrinthine approaches to confuse attackers, and, most horrifyingly, multiple escape routes leading into the island's main tunnel network. Killing the occupants of a pillbox didn't necessarily stop them. It often just relocated them. "Ventilation shaft, Sarge. Looks like a main line," Hayes whispered, pointing to a cleverly concealed opening partially covered by shattered lava rock near the Motoyama airstrip runway, which we had finally managed to reach, albeit under constant fire. It was impossible to see the bottom. The shaft was perhaps 3 feet square. "Standard procedure," I said, my voice hoarse from the dust and yelling. "Grits, prepare the fuel mix. We're going to purge the system." Flamethrowers were the psychological keystone of this battle. They were weapons of absolute terror and efficiency in the confined space of a bunker. A satchel charge neutralized a position. A flamethrower cleared it, removing any chance of the defenders using the tunnel later, or mounting a countercharge. It was brutal, but necessary. Grits knelt, checking the pressure of his M2-2 flamethrower. The fuel tanks alone weighed 70 pounds, a crushing burden in this terrain, but the payoff was a concentrated stream of thickened gasoline, capable of maintaining combustion at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. "Ready, Sarge. Hit it, Grits. 10 seconds. Full throttle." The nozzle roared, spitting a thick, fiery stream down the dark shaft. The sound was immediately swallowed by the earth, followed an instant later by a deep, hollow whooshing sound, like a giant clearing its throat. The earth around the shaft began to vibrate, and then a faint, high-pitched screaming began, echoing up from the depths. It was the most terrible sound of the war. We stood there, listening to the death cries swallowed by the ground, the smell of burning oil and burning flesh wafting back up the shaft. "Hold!" I ordered, though Grits looked like he wanted to keep burning until the entire island was glass. The screaming ceased. The only sound was the crackle of residual flames deep below. Hayes looked sick, leaning against a half-track. "My God, Eli! How many men were in there?" "Doesn't matter, Hayes," I said, my voice flat. "They put themselves there. Kurabayashi's plan demands maximum delay. Every man in those tunnels has accepted that he is a spent bullet. They're not fighting to live. They're fighting to cost us lives." This was the core of my creeping dread. The realization that the enemy's tactics weren't based on conventional defense, but on a grim, industrial calculation of casualty ratios. We were paying for every yard with American lives, and the Japanese leadership knew the exact conversion rate. Every Marine we lost here was one less man capable of attacking the home islands. The tunnels themselves were staggering in their complexity. We found evidence of hospitals, command centers, and even enormous cisterns for water storage. The Japanese soldiers were designed to be self-sufficient killing machines, operating independently below the bombing and shelling. One afternoon, clearing a complex near the Motoyama No. 1 airfield, we breached a horizontal tunnel entrance, discovering not a firing post, but an intersection. The walls were lined with burlap sacks filled with ash to absorb shrapnel. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of human waste and sweat. We moved cautiously, M1S ready, navigating by the narrow beams of our flashlights. The tunnels were dark and claustrophobic. This was not a quick fight. This was hunting rats in a sewer system designed by engineers. Suddenly, we heard movement ahead, shuffling, heavy breathing, and the metallic clink of a rifle bolt. "Grenade!" Hayes dropped a fragmentation grenade down the tunnel. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. We advanced immediately. We found 2 Japanese soldiers. One was dead, pinned against the wall by shrapnel. The other, an officer judging by the remnants of his uniform, was wounded but clutching a short katana blade. He was screaming ritualistic slogans in Japanese, his face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate hatred. This was not the time for surrender talk. This was a place where surrender meant weakness, and weakness meant death for us. Before the officer could lunge, Grits, without a word, swung his flamethrower nozzle up. A short, sharp burst of fire. The officer instantly became a burning torch, collapsing into a shrieking pile of ash and burning cloth. We stood there, the only illumination the dim red glow of the dying fire. I looked at the scene, not with disgust, but with cold, weary acceptance. We were becoming experts at atrocity. This environment demanded it. The tunnels demanded that we abandon any pretense of clean moral warfare. "Check the corner," I ordered Hayes. Hayes walked past the charred remains. He came back, holding a map, folded and covered in tunnel markings. It was a partial schematic of the southern sector, specifically the approaches to MT Suribachi. I unfolded the map. It was a masterpiece of subterranean engineering. The tunnels didn't just connect the pillboxes, they were the pillboxes. The main defenses were routed through the mountain itself, using the lava rock as a natural shield against naval bombardment. "Mount Suribachi," I whispered. "That's the key. If we take that, the southern half of the island is blind. We need to get this map to HQ fast." But even as I spoke the words, a deeper realization settled over me. Taking the mountain wouldn't win the battle. It would just open up the next, even more brutal phase of the fight for the northern plateaus. And that mountain was still firing. We had to ascend the volcano. And we had to go now. The order came down on February 22nd. The 5th Marine Division was to seize Mount Suribachi. The 28th Regiment drew the terrible honor. My unit was attached to the leading elements, ready to neutralize any remaining cave defenses or internal resistance once the infantry secured the rim. The mountain was a dark, brooding, 550-foot monolith of volcanic cinder. Even after days of fighting, it continued to bleed fire. The slopes were treacherous, a shifting layer of black, slippery ash covering solid rock. Every upward step was a slide backward. Our advance was a torturous grind. We had to move in tight, staggered formations, constantly alert for fire. The Japanese had carved spider holes into the mountain face, perfectly camouflaged firing positions from which snipers and machine gun teams poured coordinated fire down onto the advancing Marines. The work for us engineers was constant. A small concrete pillbox, missed by the naval shelling, would suddenly erupt with fire. We'd have to crawl exposed up the steep incline under intense pressure to place a charge. The 6-second fuse felt like 3. The concussions were amplified by the mountain rock, vibrating through our bones and rattling our teeth. By the afternoon of February 23rd, exhaustion was universal. We had been fighting and moving almost non-stop for 4 days, fueled by K rations, sulfur fumes, and adrenaline. The blackish had permeated everything: our uniforms, our skin, the mechanisms of our rifles, and the deepest corners of our morale. We were perhaps 100 yards from the rim when the call came down the line. "The top is cleared. The perimeter is secure." A ragged cheer went up among the surviving Marines. It was the first true moment of elation since the landing. Taking Suribachi meant control of the southern third of the island, allowing observers to finally direct artillery fire with precision across the vast, central airfields. It was the strategic turning point everyone had craved. I slumped against a piece of igneous rock, pulling out my canteen, shaking the grit out of my mouth. Grits looked completely spent, his face streaked with soot and tears of sweat. "We did it, Sarge," he rasped, coughing violently. "We actually did it." We watched the infantrymen, men from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, scramble over the lip of the caldera. Then, a few minutes later, through my field glasses, I saw it. A small flagpole, salvaged from some debris, rose on the summit. A small American flag, perhaps 54 by 28 inches, snapped into the fierce Pacific wind. The sight was electric. Across the beach, men started screaming, crying, and blowing whistles. Ships offshore sounded their horns in a deafening chorus of triumph. For a moment, the battle stopped. Every Marine who looked up at that flag, that fragile piece of color against the overwhelming black and gray of Iwo, felt a connection to home, to purpose, to victory. But the moment of true, pure triumph lasted less than 15 minutes. I was busy checking the map captured by Hayes, comparing the tunnel coordinates with the visible terrain, when the officers started moving rapidly up the slope. "Vance, we need to clear the way. New party coming up. Get those rear entrances sealed." Major Sterling, looking immensely proud but utterly worn out, rushed past. I watched a column of Marines, carrying a noticeably larger flag, ascend the mountain. A lieutenant, accompanied by a small squad and a photographer from the Associated Press, was heading toward the summit. "What's the rush, Major?" I asked, squinting up at the scene. Sterling slowed down just long enough to bark the rationale. "The Secretary of the Navy Forestal saw the first flag from his ship. Said he wanted it as a souvenir. We can't let him take the first flag. The boys who took the mountain deserve the honor. Besides, Washington needs a symbol. This one's bigger, more visible." My sense of euphoria curdled into something cold and analytical. The first flag was organic, a spontaneous expression of victory by the men who had paid for it. This second flag was different. It was PR. It was theater. It was designed for the newspaper pages back home, not for the exhausted, fighting men below. I watched through my glasses as the men struggled with a heavy pipe used as a new flagpole. The photographer, Joe Rosenthal, positioned himself perfectly. And then, at 10:30 a.m., February 23, 1945, the massive flag was raised. It was a magnificent sight. The stars and stripes, proud and defiant against the churning smoke clouds. The image instantly became iconic, transcendent. It defined the battle for the world. And then, the moment the flag reached the pinnacle, the Japanese reminded us of the reality. From the northern end of the island, which remained almost entirely intact and bristling with defenses, the counterfire began. It wasn't haphazard. It was a precise, coordinated bombardment aimed not at the beach or the lower slopes, but specifically at the command post areas and the trails leading up to Suribachi. Plump, plump, plump. Heavy mortars, probably 120 millimeters, hammered the area where the cheering had been loudest. The symbol didn't stop the death. The propaganda moment didn't end the war. We had captured the symbolic high ground, but the reality was that the other 90% of the island, the deep, heavily fortified Motoyama plateaus where the three critical airfields lay, remained unconquered. We had taken the key to the cellar, but the main house was still locked and guarded by a ghost army underground. Eli tunnel entrance. Top side, near the summit, Hayes shouted, pointing to a dark crevice hidden by ash, mere yards from where the flag was now flapping. We grabbed our gear and scrambled the last few feet. The Japanese had planned this meticulously. They had defended the exterior just enough to draw the attack, while keeping the internal tunnels operational for a strategic counterstrike. We were minutes late. As we reached the entrance, a small group of Japanese soldiers, having emerged from the tunnels, launched a suicide charge, knives and grenades drawn, targeting the celebrating Marines. The ensuing close-quarters fight was swift, brutal, and utterly chaotic. Rifles cracked, grenades exploded against rock, and the fight for the summit became a desperate, messy struggle for control of the internal spaces. I didn't participate in the flag-raising photo. I was too busy crawling into a hole, 6 feet away from the symbol of American triumph, with a satchel charge, dealing with the reality that Kurabayashi had engineered absolute resistance, even in defeat. The flag was for the newspapers. The fight, the real fight, was down here, in the suffocating darkness. The capture of Suribachi, magnificent as a headline, only amplified the horror of the fight for the central plateaus. The landscape north of the mountain was flatter, dominated by the three critical airfields that were the ultimate prize. This area, known as Motoyama, was where General Kurabayashi had concentrated his strongest defenses. If Suribachi was the lock, Motoyama was the safe. The logistics of our advance were overwhelming. We were now pushing against defenses that were layered 3 deep, utilizing the hardened volcanic rock beneath the airstrips as an almost impenetrable shield. Our casualties mounted exponentially. By the start of March, the 5th Marine Division was already operating at severely reduced capacity. I stood in a makeshift command post, nothing more than a few sheets of corrugated metal scavenged from a ruined hangar, reviewing the day's requisitions with Major Sterling. The numbers were crushing. We expended 25 tons of high explosives today, Major. That includes 3,000 gallons of napalm fuel for the flamethrowers. Sterling rubbed his eyes, the fatigue etched into the lines of his face. And what did that buy us, Vance? 1,000 yards of ground. And how many men? 210, sir. Killed or wounded. The mathematical reality was stark. We were winning the island inch by bloody inch, but the cost was unsustainable. Kurabayashi had achieved his strategic objective, maximum delay and maximum casualty infliction. He was exchanging ground for American lives at a sickeningly efficient rate. My professional perspective as an engineer gave me a unique, horrifying view of the industrial contrast between the two armies. We were fighting men who were prepared to die in their holes, using obsolete rifles and minimal supplies, sustained only by fanaticism and discipline. We, on the other hand, were backed by the limitless manufacturing power of the American industrial machine. I had been briefed days earlier on the why of Iwo Jima. It wasn't about prestige. It wasn't even about the flag. Iwo Jima was the only available midpoint refueling and emergency landing base for the B-29 Superfortress's flying bombing missions from the Marianas, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, to the Japanese home islands. The round trip was nearly 3,000 miles. Without Iwo, damaged B-29s had no safe haven and would ditch in the ocean. "Every pillbox we clear, every tunnel we burn," Major Sterling had told us in a rare moment of strategic clarity, "is buying safe passage for those bombers. It's not a fight for ground, Vance. It's a fight for air superiority, purchased with Marine blood." The revelation chilled me to the core. My small, dirty job, crawling through dark holes, facing men with bayonets, setting fuses, was a microscopic but vital cog in a massive logistical equation. I closed my eyes and pictured it, not the screaming man I had just burned, but the Detroit factories churning out aluminum sheeting, the Kansas refineries pumping high-octane fuel, the assembly lines in California welding together the massive, silver B-29s. The contrast was absolute. We were fighting flesh and rock against steel and mathematics. We had all the steel. We had all the math. But we were the ones paying the human price. That evening, we received a new shipment of demolition supplies. Not just standard explosives, but specialized shaped charges designed to penetrate the deepest concrete. The crates were marked, "Urgent priority, B-29 support." As I unpacked the specialized explosives, their heavy, oily smell filling the air, I felt the grim weight of my purpose. We weren't heroes fighting for freedom on a foreign shore. We were highly specialized logistics support, paid for in blood, clearing the way for machines to fly home safely. My professional focus sharpened into a cold, almost detached ruthlessness. The enemy was not a man. The enemy was an obstacle. And I was the tool designed to systematically eliminate obstacles. We moved onto the highest, central plateau, the killing ground known as Bloody Gorge, and Turkey Knob. The fire here was constant, merging from hundreds of interconnected positions. Snipers were embedded in the sheer cliffs, firing down with unnerving accuracy. "Sarge, look at this position," Hayes called out, pointing to a massive overhang near the edge of a ravine. "It's huge. It's not a machine gun, it's a main battery." I studied the location through my glasses. Hidden by perfect camouflage, a massive 150mm howitzer had been lowered into a cavern and sealed with concrete, leaving only a horizontal slit for the barrel. It commanded the entire airfield approach. It was a fortress weapon, utterly impervious to direct frontal fire. "That's Kurabayashi's work, all right," I muttered. "They don't move. They just wait for us to walk into the kill zone." The howitzer position was firing slowly but deliberately, each round dropping with devastating impact on our advancing armor. We had to take it out. But any attempt to approach the front would be suicidal. I looked at the captured map. The tunnel schematic showed a maintenance access shaft leading to the rear of the howitzer's cavern, a narrow, secondary passage, likely meant only for ammunition replenishment. "Hayes, Grits," I said, pointing toward a small, almost undetectable fissure in the lava rock about 50 yards down the ravine. "We're not going through the front door. We're going through the sewer system. Get the shape charges ready. We're going to put this gun to sleep, permanently." The weight of the explosives felt heavier than ever. We weren't just clearing tunnels anymore. We were going into the throat of the beast. We were going to meet the men who had spent months carving their own tombs, facing them in their final sanctuary. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this would be the fight where professional precision collided with the ultimate limit of human endurance. The fissure was barely wide enough for a single man to crawl through. It was covered by a thin layer of wire mesh and loose ash, designed to give way immediately if stepped on, but strong enough to conceal the entrance. I checked my rifle, took a deep breath, and slid into the darkness. The air inside was thick and hot, laced with the metallic tang of unspent propellant and the pervasive, cloying smell of sweat and waste. My flashlight beam cut a weak yellow path through the gloom. The tunnel was rough-hewn, blasted out of the igneous rock, and narrow enough that my pack constantly scraped the sides. Hayes followed close behind, his breathing heavy but steady. Grits, unable to safely maneuver the bulky flamethrower in the tight space, was left guarding the entrance. A terrifying, lonely job. "Slow, Hayes! Listen for noise. The walls should transmit sound well." We advanced perhaps 50 feet, crawling on our bellies. The tunnel sloped downwards, indicating we were penetrating deep into the rock formation that held the massive howitzer. The sound found us before we found the enemy. Not the distant roar of battle, but a low, guttural chanting. They were inside. They knew their position was likely breached, or perhaps they were simply preparing for their daily fate. The sound was hypnotic, terrifyingly resigned. I stopped, pressing my ear against the damp rock. I could hear distinct sounds now: the grinding of gears, the heavy thud of ammunition being shifted, and the muffled voices of men coordinating the fire of the 150mm gun. The schematic had been right. We were in the rear maintenance shaft, leading directly to the gun's ammunition storage cavern. I signaled Hayes to halt. I pulled out the specialized shaped charges. These were different from the standard satchel charges. They focused the blast into a narrow, concentrated jet, capable of punching through several feet of reinforced concrete or solid rock. They were designed to kill machinery and men where conventional explosives failed. "We have to place this on the wall separating us from the chamber," I whispered. "If the schematic is correct, that wall is thin enough to conceal a door, but thick enough to withstand shrapnel. We need to blow the wall and drop the main gun mount in one go." The tunnel abruptly opened into a small, natural cavern, a side chamber used for storing tools. In the center of the floor, a shaft dropped vertically, a deep, dark hole that smelled of fuel oil and metal. An elevator shaft, likely for ammunition. Suddenly, a loud, metallic screech echoed from the vertical shaft. The elevator was coming up. "Incoming!" I hissed. We flattened ourselves against the rock wall. In the dim light, I saw the cage rising. It carried not ammunition, but 2 Japanese soldiers, their faces grim, carrying buckets of rations. They were armed with Type 99 rifles, and appeared utterly focused on their task. They didn't see us immediately. They stepped out of the cage, their backs to us. There was no time for finesse. No time for a silent approach. If we let them get into the main chamber, the entire garrison would be alerted. I raised my M1 and fired a short, controlled burst. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was shattering. The first soldier dropped instantly, his body hitting the ground with a sickening wet thump. The second spun, dropping his bucket, and raised his rifle. Hayes fired simultaneously. The soldier crumpled, his helmet clanging against the rock floor. The echoes of the gunfire reverberated through the vast, subterranean network. Silence now felt impossible. We had announced our presence to the heart of Kurabayashi's fortress. "Fuse it! Now!" I ordered. I raced to the wall of the main chamber. It was a concrete slab, cleverly disguised as natural rock. I quickly peeled the backing off the massive block of shaped charge, sticky with adhesive, and slapped it hard onto the concrete. I threaded the fuse, inserting the blasting cap. My hands, though sweaty, moved with the clockwork precision of years of training. The professional detachment returned. This was a calculation, a purely mechanical process of destruction. Click. I set the timer. 3 minutes. We needed time to get back to Grits and escape the primary blast zone. As I pulled back, I noticed a detail I had missed in the initial chaos. A narrow, dark opening beneath the wall, perhaps a foot high, a drainage port. Suddenly, a blinding burst of fire erupted from the port. A machine pistol. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat. I felt a blinding, hot pain tear through my left arm. I stumbled backward, dropping my rifle. Hayes immediately returned fire, sweeping the port with his M1. The machine pistol fire ceased. "Eli! You hit?" Hayes yelled, dropping to my side. "Keep going! The charge is set. 3 minutes." I forced myself to stand, the pain searing through my bicep. We retreated, scrambling back into the narrow fissure. The adrenaline was now pumping, mixed with the shock of the injury. We clawed our way back toward the entrance, the rough rock tearing at my skin, ignoring the spreading warmth in my sleeve. 1 minute. We reached Grits. "Get out! Move! 3 minutes!" I yelled, collapsing against the rock face outside the tunnel entrance. Grits looked horrified, seeing my arm, but he reacted instantly. He started dragging me away from the fissure. The howitzer still fired. Boom! Boom! It was maintaining its deadly, relentless rhythm, unaware of the explosive cancer growing within its walls. I heard the sound of the Japanese inside, screaming, running, desperately trying to find the breach. They had realized they were trapped. We reached a small depression 50 yards away, just as the timer hit 0. The explosion was not the sharp, contained bang of a standard charge. It was a deep, earth-shaking concussion. The shaped charge did its job perfectly. The sound was followed by a massive, groaning roar of tearing concrete and collapsing rock. A geyser of smoke, pulverized rock, and debris erupted from the main firing slit of the howitzer position. The 150 mm howitzer fell silent. Permanently. I lay in the dirt, gazing at the massive plume of dust rising from the fortress position. My arm throbbed, but I felt a wave of cold professional satisfaction wash over me. The geometry was restored. The machine was disabled. But the silence that followed was not one of victory. It was the silence of men buried alive, the silence of a structure imploding, the silence that marked the absolute, final cost of one strategic objective. We had taken the heart of the fortress. But the battle was far from over. The fissure was barely wide enough for a single man to crawl through. It was covered by a thin layer of wire mesh and loose ash, designed to give way immediately if stepped on, but strong enough to conceal the entrance. I checked my rifle, took a deep breath, and slid into the darkness. The air inside was thick and hot, laced with the metallic tang of unspent propellant and the pervasive, cloying smell of sweat and waste. My flashlight beam cut a weak yellow path through the gloom. The tunnel was rough-hewn, blasted out of the igneous rock, and narrow enough that my pack constantly scraped the sides. Hayes followed close behind, his breathing heavy but steady. Grits, unable to safely maneuver the bulky flamethrower in the tight space, was left guarding the entrance. A terrifying, lonely job. "Slow, Hayes! Listen for noise. The walls should transmit sound well." We advanced perhaps 50 feet, crawling on our bellies. The tunnel sloped downwards, indicating we were penetrating deep into the rock formation that held the massive howitzer. The sound found us before we found the enemy. Not the distant roar of battle, but a low, guttural chanting. They were inside. They knew their position was likely breached, or perhaps they were simply preparing for their daily fate. The sound was hypnotic, terrifyingly resigned. I stopped, pressing my ear against the damp rock. I could hear distinct sounds now, the grinding of gears, the heavy thud of ammunition being shifted, and the muffled voices of men coordinating the fire of the 150mm gun. The schematic had been right. We were in the rear maintenance shaft, leading directly to the gun's ammunition storage cavern. I signaled Hayes to halt. I pulled out the specialized shape charges. These were different from the standard satchel charges. They focused the blast into a narrow, concentrated jet, capable of punching through several feet of reinforced concrete or solid rock. They were designed to kill machinery and men where conventional explosives failed. "We have to place this on the wall separating us from the chamber," I whispered. "If the schematic is correct, that wall is thin enough to conceal a door, but thick enough to withstand shrapnel. We need to blow the wall and drop the main gun mount in one go." The tunnel abruptly opened into a small, natural cavern, a side chamber used for storing tools. In the center of the floor, a shaft dropped vertically, a deep, dark hole that smelled of fuel oil and metal. An elevator shaft, likely for ammunition. Suddenly, a loud, metallic screech echoed from the vertical shaft. The elevator was coming up. "Incoming!" I hissed. We flattened ourselves against the rock wall. In the dim light, I saw the cage rising. It carried not ammunition, but 2 Japanese soldiers, their faces grim, carrying buckets of rations. They were armed with Type 99 rifles and appeared utterly focused on their task. They didn't see us immediately. They stepped out of the cage, their backs to us. There was no time for finesse. No time for a silent approach. If we let them get into the main chamber, the entire garrison would be alerted. I raised my M1 and fired a short, controlled burst. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was shattering. The first soldier dropped instantly, his body hitting the ground with a sickening wet thump. The second spun, dropping his bucket, and raised his rifle. Hayes fired simultaneously. The soldier crumpled, his helmet clanging against the rock floor. The echoes of the gunfire reverberated through the vast, subterranean network. Silence now felt impossible. We had announced our presence to the heart of Kurabayashi's fortress. "Fuse it! Now!" I ordered. I raced to the wall of the main chamber. It was a concrete slab, cleverly disguised as natural rock. I quickly peeled the backing off the massive block of shaped charge, sticky with adhesive, and slapped it hard onto the concrete. I threaded the fuse, inserting the blasting cap. My hands, though sweaty, moved with the clockwork precision of years of training. The professional detachment returned. This was a calculation, a purely mechanical process of destruction. Click. I set the timer. 3 minutes. We needed time to get back to Grits and escape the primary blast zone. As I pulled back, I noticed a detail I had missed in the initial chaos. A narrow, dark opening beneath the wall, perhaps a foot high, a drainage port. Suddenly, a blinding burst of fire erupted from the port. A machine pistol. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat. I felt a blinding, hot pain tear through my left arm. I stumbled backward, dropping my rifle. Hayes immediately returned fire, sweeping the port with his M1. The machine pistol fire ceased. "Eli! You hit?" Hayes yelled, dropping to my side. "Keep going! The charge is set. 3 minutes!" I forced myself to stand, the pain searing through my bicep. We retreated, scrambling back into the narrow fissure. The adrenaline was now pumping, mixed with the shock of the injury. We clawed our way back toward the entrance, the rough rock tearing at my skin, ignoring the spreading warmth in my sleeve. 1 minute. We reached Grits. "Get out! Move! 3 minutes!" I yelled, collapsing against the rock face outside the tunnel entrance. Grits looked horrified, seeing my arm, but he reacted instantly. He started dragging me away from the fissure. The howitzer still fired. Boom! Boom! It was maintaining its deadly, relentless rhythm, unaware of the explosive cancer growing within its walls. I heard the sound of the Japanese inside, screaming, running, desperately trying to find the breach. They had realized they were trapped. We reached a small depression 50 yards away, just as the timer hit 0. The explosion was not the sharp, contained bang of a standard charge. It was a deep, earth-shaking concussion. The shaped charge did its job perfectly. The sound was followed by a massive, groaning roar of tearing concrete and collapsing rock. A geyser of smoke, pulverized rock, and debris erupted from the main firing slit of the howitzer position. The 150 mm howitzer fell silent. Permanently. I lay in the dirt, gazing at the massive plume of dust rising from the fortress position. My arm throbbed, but I felt a wave of cold professional satisfaction wash over me. The geometry was restored. The machine was disabled. But the silence that followed was not one of victory. It was the silence of men buried alive, the silence of a structure imploding, the silence that marked the absolute, final cost of one strategic objective. We had taken the heart of the fortress. But the battle was far from over. The destruction of the 150 mm howitzer emplacement was a turning point, not in the battle's severity, but in its character. It demonstrated that even Kurabayashi's deepest fortifications were vulnerable to systematic, professional demolition. The remaining defenses, concentrated in the north, were fought with increasing desperation by the Japanese and cold, surgical precision by the Marines. The calendar advanced through early and mid-March, but the war remained suspended in the gray volcanic dust. The entire island was now a graveyard, pockmarked by thousands of shell holes, saturated with the smell of death, sulfur, and burning napalm. We slept in shallow scrapes in the ash, enduring constant counterinfiltration attempts at night, the desperate, often final, banzai charges of men who refused to accept defeat. By the 20th of March, the organized resistance was largely crushed. The Marines had suffered nearly 26,000 casualties, including 6,800 killed, a staggering 30% of the entire landing force. The Japanese defense had been obliterated, with nearly 21,000 men killed, almost the entire garrison. My left arm was bandaged tightly, the bullet having passed clean through the muscle. The pain was a dull, constant throb, now just another layer of the physical exhaustion that enveloped us all. March 26th. Official declaration of the end of organized resistance. The island was declared secure. I stood on the ridge overlooking Motoyama No. 1 airfield. It was unrecognizable. The paved runways were cracked and cratered, but Seabees were already at work, bulldozing ash and laying temporary steel matting. The speed of the American logistical engine, the contrast I had mused about weeks earlier, was now manifest. Victory was achieved not through bravery alone, but through overwhelming industrial capacity that could repair and rebuild faster than the enemy could destroy. I saw it then, the immediate strategic payoff. A massive, 4-engine B-29 Super Fortress appeared low on the horizon. It wasn't a mission aircraft, it was a wreck. One of its 4 engines was trailing smoke, and its fuselage was visibly peppered with anti-aircraft fire, reflecting the deadly journey from the Japanese mainland. The huge bomber descended rapidly, wobbling slightly, then touched down smoothly on the hastily repaired runway. Its crew emerged, shaken but alive. I watched another B-29, and then a third, land over the next hour. These were the cripples, the aircraft that would have had to ditch into the Pacific, sacrificing their crews and the multi-million-dollar machinery. "Look, Eli," Hayes said, pointing. "That's why we were here." I nodded, watching the mechanics swarm the crippled superfortress. Every Marine who had died here, the men who drowned in the ash, the men Grits had burned in the tunnels, The men caught by the howitzer we destroyed had paid for the safe passage of those metal behemoths. The sheer scale of the sacrifice finally hit me, divorced from the immediacy of combat. We hadn't fought for a hill or an airfield. We had fought for a few square miles of desolate rock, purely for the sake of an alternate survival option for air crews. The cost was astronomical. The exchange rate, roughly 4 Marines killed or wounded for every Japanese defender annihilated. I looked at the ground beneath my feet. It was black, sterile, and still radiated heat. It was a place where nothing grew, and now, a place where thousands of young men would never grow old. Later that day, I was handed a leaflet from the mainland. It was the famous photograph, captured by Joe Rosenthal, 6 Marines struggling to raise the large flag atop Suribachi. It was already a sensation back home, a monumental symbol of heroism and American resolve. I remembered the moment clearly. The instant the flag went up, the cheering, and then the counter-barrage from the north that had sent us scrambling back into the caves. I looked at the photo, recognizing the silhouette of one of the men. Harlan Block, a Texan who had been killed a week later, far north on the island. Only 3 of the 6 men in that famous photograph survived the battle. "They're heroes," an officer said, patting my shoulder. "That picture won the war, in terms of morale." I felt a profound, weary disconnect. The picture was a lie, a necessary lie perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. It captured a moment of theater, not the grinding, demoralizing reality of the tunnels. The real heroism wasn't in standing dramatically against the sky with a piece of cloth. It was in the suffocating darkness, facing a man who would kill you and then blow himself up just to deny you the tunnel. The symbol of Iwo Jima wasn't the flag for me. It was the ash, black, sticky, eternally hot, and utterly indifferent to human life or death. The earth itself was the enemy, aiding the defenders and swallowing the attackers. I thought of General Kurabayashi. He was confirmed dead, rumored to have led a final, suicidal charge deep in the northern sector. He had failed to stop the invasion, but he had succeeded spectacularly in his primary mission, making the invasion so costly that the American public might question the price of the next step. I felt no hatred for him, only a chilling, professional respect. He understood resources. He understood calculation. He had used his limited asset, the lives of his men, to inflict maximum strategic damage on our morale and manpower. I was tasked with one last, ceremonial duty, detonating the last remaining cave entrance discovered near the shoreline, a large, intricate storage bunker that held no fighting men, just supplies. I placed the charges, ensuring they were sufficient to collapse the entire mouth of the cave. As I set the timer, I looked into the darkness one last time. It was cool inside, a momentary reprieve from the heat of the air. I ignited the fuse. FZZZZ. I walked away without looking back. The explosion was muted by the soft ash, a final, muffled thud of destruction. The battle for Iwo Jima was over. The 36 days of blood and ash were complete. We had paid the absolute price for the right to land B-29s. I looked at my bandaged arm, dusted gray with the ubiquitous ash. I had survived, not because I was luckier or braver, but because I was a better engineer. I had treated the war as a demolition problem, a series of geometric challenges to be solved with mathematics and high explosives. But the mathematics couldn't account for the sulfur in my lungs, or the screams in the tunnels. That was the human cost, the residue of the transaction. We packed our gear, leaving the island to the Seabees and the newly arrived air crews. We were being shipped back for rest and reconstitution. We were survivors, but we were not the same men who landed. As the transport ship pulled away, I stared at the dark, desolate silhouette of Iwo Jima, dominated by the distant, scarred cone of Suribachi. The huge American flag, the one destined for the history books, was still flying high against the sky. It was a symbol of victory. But for me, it would forever be tethered to the smell of burning fuel and the cold, hard logic of a subterranean battlefield. We won the rock. The enemy made sure we never forgot the cost.